Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here, we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams. Before dawn, the hills of Medellín lie under a hush so complete it feels almost sacred. The air is heavy with the scent of wet earth and eucalyptus, and the first pale threads of light slide down from the mountains like hesitant ghosts. Somewhere in that mist, engines hum a small convoy winding its way through the valley roads. The headlights move slowly, not in haste, but with a strange, calm authority. At its center sits a man whose name will soon echo far beyond these mountains, though at this moment, he is only a silhouette framed by fog and quiet power. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria watches the world pass through the glass of the car window. He is not yet the legend or the monster that history will remember, but the outline of both already lives in him. Outside, the city is still asleep. Dogs bark in the distance, roosters crow, and the streets glisten with last night's rain. Medellín breathes a restless, dreaming city. Neither fully awake nor at peace, he thinks of how far he has come from the modest house of his mother. Hermilda Gaviria, a schoolteacher who once believed her son's quick mind would lead him somewhere good. She had no idea how fiercely he would crave the kind of greatness that money could buy. For Pablo, the world had always seemed divided between those who took and those who begged. As a boy he had chosen which side he would stand on, long before he knew what it would cost him. In these early mornings, he often feels that the valley itself is whispering to him. The fog hides everything, the poverty of the barrios, the bright lights of the wealthy neighborhoods, the soldiers' checkpoints on for a moment. The world seems suspended in perfect equality. Only he, perhaps, believes he can bend that silence into his own design. The car slows at a turn. One of his men steps out to check the road. Even now, there is caution in every movement, a constant awareness that power is never absolute. Pablo's eyes follow the shape of the man in the mist, and he feels that familiar pulse of control, the knowledge that a single word from him could decide fate. It is not violence that fascinates him, but command, the invisible thread that makes others move before he speaks. He was never a man of patience, yet he understood the rhythm of timing. In business, in negotiation, in danger, silence often spoke louder than declarations. Those who underestimated him learned that the quiet ones could be the most dangerous. He once told an associate that he would rather lose a fortune than lose respect. Money could always return. Reputation, once cracked, could never be rebuilt. The convoy continues upward, the road narrowing as the hills grow steeper. The clouds hang low, almost brushing the treetops. In the half-light, the city below resembles a constellation of tiny fires burning in the damp air. Pablo gazes down at it with something between pride and possession. Every street has a memory for him, deals struck in small cafes, promises made under flickering bulbs, ambitions whispered between friends who are now either rich, dead, or both. He remembers the first time he tasted real power. Not money in his hand, but influence, the way doors opened, the way fear softened voices. It was intoxicating in a way that nothing else could ever be. From that moment, the hunger became endless. He would tell himself it was for his family, for the poor, for the people forgotten by the government, but deep inside, he knew it was simpler. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted immortality written in the currency of his own making. The mist begins to thin as the sun edges over the ridge. Gold light spills across the valley, revealing rooftops, church spires, and the winding river that cuts through Medellín like a silver vein. The city seems peaceful now, unaware of what history is preparing behind its quiet facade. In that moment, the man in the car could almost pass for a statesman, a benefactor, a father on his way to work. Appearances have always been his greatest weapon. He wears them as other men wear armor. To understand Pablo Escobar, one must understand the landscape that shaped him. Colombia in the 1970s is a country of contradictions, lush and beautiful, yet scarred by inequality. For those born without privilege, the ladder to success often ends before the first rung. Escobar learned early that rules were designed to keep men like him at the bottom. So he began to write his own. Each small act of defiance, smuggling cigarettes, bribing a guard, bargaining for stolen goods was a lesson in power's mechanics. Respect followed fear, and fear followed wealth. He learned that generosity could be as effective as intimidation. A handful of cash to a struggling family bought loyalty stronger than any threat. Over time, entire neighborhoods would come to see him as a protector, a man who gave when the government would not. The paradox that would one day define him was already alive. The outlaw and the savior sharing the same heartbeat. Now, as he sits in the warmth of the car, his thoughts drift between pride and unease. He knows that every empire, legitimate or not, is built on sand. But he tells himself that his will be different. His will endure because it is born from the people, not against them. It is a comforting lie, and like all great lies, he almost believes it. A radio hums softly from the front seat news. Traffic, the small chatter of ordinary life. It feels distant, like another world. Pablo closes his eyes and listens to the rhythm of the rain tapping against the roof. The sound reminds him of the nights he could not sleep, counting the drops as they fell on the corrugated metal of his childhood home. Back then, rain was only weather. Now, it feels like prophecy. Outside, the convoy reaches a ridge overlooking the city. The cars stop. Doors open. Men step out into the morning chill. From here, Medellín stretches wide and shimmering under the newborn light. Pablo steps onto the wet gravel, his shoes sinking slightly into the earth. For a long moment, he says nothing. He simply watches the valley breathe, the mist curling away like smoke from a candle. In his eyes, the city is not a place, it's a canvas waiting for his signature. He knows that one day the world will remember his name, not as a footnote, but as a force. The question that lingers, though unspoken, is what price memory demands. He exhales, slow and deliberate, a single thread of breath that disappears into the cool air. The men wait for his signal to move again. Behind them, the first sounds of morning traffic drift up from the streets below horns. Laughter, vendors calling out their wares. Life begins, unaware of the destiny unfolding above it. Pablo turns back toward the car. The door closes with a muted thud. The engine starts, blending with the hum of the city awakening beneath the clouds. As the convoy rolls forward, the valley swallows the last traces of mist. Somewhere inside him, he senses that the path ahead will be both his making and his undoing. But for now, in this calm before the storm, all he feels is the steady rhythm of the road and the weight of a dream too. Vast to measure, every empire begins with a whisper. Before the empire, before the name became legend, there was a boy standing beneath the rusted lamplight of Medellin. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked dust and gasoline, and the world around him seemed to tremble with quiet hunger. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was not yet a man of power. He was simply a boy who refused to remain unseen. The city in the 1960s was a storm of noise and contradiction, the cry of vendors in the markets, the distant echo of gunfire from political unrest, and the low hum of engines winding through streets that clung to the sides of mountains. The poor lived close to the sky, in the hills, where homes leaned against each other like weary men. Down below, the city glittered with the promise of wealth that seemed to belong to everyone and no one. It was here that Escobar's restless spirit began to sharpen. He moved through the crowded alleys with a gaze too steady for his age, noticing everything, the way money changed hands, the way men spoke softly when danger passed, the invisible rules that governed survival. He was a quiet observer, but inside him grew a certainty that he was meant to bend those rules, not follow them. His mother, Hermilda, a schoolteacher, dreamed that her son might rise through learning, that he might escape the poverty that shadowed their days. She never saw how deeply that hunger had already taken root. Pablo admired her resolve, yet he sensed that the world would not reward goodness alone. Around him, men with sharp suits and sharper tongues thrived, not because they were honest, but because they were unafraid. In the evenings, he would sit near the road and watch motorcycles glide past, their riders faceless behind clouds of dust. The sound stayed with him, a roar that cut through silence, a symbol of motion and freedom. He wanted that. Not the machine itself, but what it represented. A life that answered to no one. The streets became his classroom. Cigarettes, contraband radios, small things that moved unseen from hand to hand. He learned how to make them disappear, how to make them reappear elsewhere for profit. His mind worked like a map, tracing invisible lines between supply and demand, between risk and reward. There was no violence in it, not yet. Only calculation, only control. Medellin was a city built on contradictions. Churches stood beside gambling halls. Children carried groceries for priests, while thieves whispered deals in the same doorways. It was a place that taught him that power had many faces, and that the law, more often than not, served those who could afford to bend it. Pablo learned early how to speak softly to policemen, how to offer a folded bill with a nod that promised discretion. It was not rebellion. It was adaptation. To survive in Colombia during those years meant understanding how deeply corruption had woven itself into daily life. He began with small ventures, cigarettes smuggled through back roads, radios hidden beneath crates of produce, and later, more daring schemes. There was a story that he once stole gravestones, sanding off the names to sell the marble to sculptors. Whether it was true or not, it became part of the legend, a symbol of his audacity, his refusal to let anything remain sacred if it stood between him and opportunity. He moved through the fog of the city like a shadow made of intent. Each act taught him something about leverage, about how to read a man's weakness and how to turn it into strength. The 1960s in Colombia were years of unrest. Political factions clashed, the countryside bled from conflicts that felt endless, and the divide between rich and poor grew like a wound that would not close. For a boy like Escobar, ambition was not greed, It was survival shaped into purpose. He watched men with polished shoes step out of limousines while others dug through trash for scraps. And he decided that one day he would not be one of the forgotten. His early companions were boys like him, clever and hungry. Together they schemed in the dim corners of cafes, whispering about easy money and bigger dreams. They were not rebels in the political sense. They were architects of their own escape, designing a future in which the rules belonged to them. Pablo's gift was not just his courage, but his patience. Where others rushed toward danger, he studied it. He could wait, still as stone, until the moment was right. He understood that control required calm, the kind of calm that unnerved those around him. His eyes rarely betrayed emotion, yet behind them flickered the steady flame of desire. He did not seek chaos. He sought order on his terms. To him, crime was not rebellion. It was correction, a way to balance a world that had always tilted against him. Rain often fell in Medellín, as if the heavens themselves were exhausted by the city's contradictions. When it came, the tin roofs drummed softly, and the streets reflected the yellow glow of streetlights like pools of molten gold. On such nights, Pablo would walk alone, the rain soaking through his shirt, the air rich with the smell of wet earth and petrol. He liked the solitude it brought, the way the world grew quiet enough for him to hear his own thoughts. He was not yet the man history would remember. He was only the echo of what he would become, a young dreamer standing at the edge of something vast, unknowable and darkly alluring as the years passed. The boy who once bartered cigarettes began to deal in larger shadows. His confidence deepened, his circle widened. The world began to bend slightly around him, as though sensing the gravity of his ambition. Yet, even then, he carried within him the echo of those early days, the smell of rain, the hum of motorcycles, the memory of his mother's tired eyes. These were the ghosts that shaped him. They whispered to him of a destiny written not in laws, but in will. In the stillness of one quiet dawn, he stood overlooking the valley, watching the fog drift like smoke over the city that had both birthed and betrayed him. Below, Medellín was waking, a restless giant of noise and neon. Above, he felt the pulse of something larger, something inevitable. The seeds had been planted. They would soon take root in the dark soil of a country ready to believe in legends. And as the sun broke over the mountains, Pablo Escobar smiled faintly, as though he already knew the world would one day speak his name with both fear and fascination. Every dream begins as defiance. Every empire begins as a thought that refuses to die. The 1970s arrived like a storm rolling down from the Andes, slow at first, then unstoppable. The world was changing. In America, disco lights pulsed in smoky rooms. In Europe, the night grew longer, louder, more restless. Beneath the noise, a new desire spread, invisible, insatiable, white as winter. In Colombia, Pablo Escobar could feel it before he saw it. Opportunity often whispers before it speaks, and in the humid air of Antioquia, that whisper became a calling. He had grown beyond the backstreet hustles of Medellín, the petty schemes, the cigarette runs, the tombstones. They had been lessons, nothing more. Now he listened for something greater. Rumors moved through the city like the low hum of a distant engine. A new trade rising from the jungles, a powder so light it could float on a breath, yet valuable enough to bend nations. Cocaine, they called it the white gold. It was cleaner, easier to move, and unlike anything before it. It carried the illusion of sophistication. To Escobar, it was not just a product, it was destiny, a convergence of timing and ambition. He began in quiet corners, as always, observing before acting. The early couriers were farmers, pilots, dreamers, men who had grown tired of the land giving them so little. They told stories of foreign buyers who would pay fortunes for a few kilos, of hidden airstrips where the night sky glowed faintly from the roar of small planes. Escobar listened and weighed every word. He understood that fortune favored not the reckless, but the organized. The chaos of others was his opportunity to impose order. He journeyed south, where the jungles thickened and the rivers ran slow and dark, their surfaces glimmering like sheets of glass. The air there was heavy with the scent of earth and fuel, a mixture of nature and machine. Beneath the canopy, men worked in silence, faces veiled in sweat, leaves crunching underfoot. They crushed, processed, packed, turning plants into powder, dreams into gold. Escobar watched, and something in him shifted. He saw not crime, but industry. Not risk, but inevitability. The jungles of Colombia were beautiful in their secrecy. Mountains rose like giants from the mist, hiding entire worlds beneath their green skin. To the untrained eye, it was wilderness. To Escobar, it was a labyrinth of opportunity. He began to build connections. Farmers who needed money, pilots who needed purpose, police who needed silence. Each man played his part. Each handshake tightened the web. It was not chaos. It was choreography by the time the decade reached its middle years. Escobar's network stretched like a shadow across borders. From the coca fields to hidden runways, from small boats slipping across the Caribbean to planes vanishing into Florida's night sky. Everything moved with precision. He was no longer a hustler. He was a conductor. Yet through it all, his presence remained ghost-like. He preferred quiet power, influence that worked unseen. Money began to flow faster than imagination could contain it. The first shipment brought more profit than a lifetime of small hustles. The second doubled it. By the third, Escobar understood that the game had changed forever. He had found the perfect storm, a product the world craved, a system too hungry to resist, and a country too fractured to stop him. Still, he carried himself with restraint, his tone measured, his words deliberate. Power, he believed, must never shout. It should hum softly, like the sound of engines in the dark. He began to dream in numbers, fleets, tons, dollars, influence. Wealth became language. Control, its grammar. Every new runway carved into the earth was another verse in a poem only he understood. Yet beneath the calculation, there remained something almost spiritual. He saw himself as an architect, reshaping the balance between poverty and privilege. He convinced himself that he was not stealing from the world, but claiming what it had long denied him. That belief, pure and poisonous, would one day define everything. The first cartel meeting was nothing like the grand councils of legend. It took place in a quiet farmhouse on the outskirts of Medellín. A handful of men sat around a table, scarred by time, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and rain. They spoke in low tones, marking the beginnings of an empire with nothing more than trust and fear. Escobar, calm and confident, proposed structure where there had been none. He spoke of roots, of loyalty, of vision. They listened, sensing the gravity of his conviction. It was not charisma that held them, it was inevitability. He made them believe that together they could own the horizon. Outside, the rain fell steadily, soft and endless. It was as if the world itself paused to listen. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a plane took off, its engines slicing through the mist. Inside its cargo hold was powder, sealed and silent, the beginning of fortunes that would rewrite Colombia's history. Escobar watched it disappear into the night sky. The reflection of its lights shimmered briefly in his eyes. With every successful run, his legend deepened. Money flowed through his hands like water, impossible to count, impossible to contain. He bought land, fleets, influence, yet he moved carefully, always cloaked in the illusion of simplicity. To the poor, he became a symbol of defiance. To the powerful, a growing threat. Between the two, he built a bridge made of both fear and fascination. But with power came distance. The man who once walked the rain-soaked streets of Medellín now stood above them, unreachable. Each triumph carved away another piece of humility, leaving only the hunger that had driven him from the start. The air around him grew thinner, colder. Wealth was no longer a tool, it was identity. Success, no longer a goal. It was a mirror in which he saw the face of destiny staring back in the quiet hours before dawn. When the valley slept beneath a blanket of fog, Escobar often stood by his window, the city lights flickering like embers below. He would think of the boy he once was, barefoot, watching motorcycles race through the rain, and wonder whether that boy would recognize the man he had become. The world had opened its gates to him, but he was already building walls of his own. Every kingdom begins as a dream of control, and as the first light of morning touched the hills of Medellín, Pablo Escobar stood at the threshold of his empire, a man who believed he had mastered the game, unaware that the same roads leading outward to glory would, one day, lead him back into the mist. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar's name had become a kind of weather in Colombia, something everyone lived beneath. It was no longer whispered, it was inhaled. His reach had seeped into every valley, every office, every corner where power met necessity. The boy who once dreamed of wealth now ruled a kingdom of his own design. But like all empires, it shimmered with beauty and danger in equal measure. At the heart of it stood Hacienda Naples, a monument to both imagination and excess, spread across thousands of acres. It was less a home than a declaration. The gates alone were a statement, marked by the shell of a private jet, one of the first aircraft he had ever used for transport. Beyond them lay manicured lawns, artificial lakes, and an unlikely zoo filled with elephants, giraffes, hippos, and flamingos, living trophies of a man who believed that if something existed in the world, it could belong to him. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and gasoline, the laughter of children mixed with the cries of wild animals. To those who visited, it felt like paradise. To Escobar, it was proof that he had conquered his destiny. Every wall, every statue, every marble fountain was more than luxury. It was control made visible. His guests would often find him walking through the grounds at dawn, barefoot, cigarette in hand, gazing at the fog lifting over the trees. He liked the silence before the world awoke. To some, he spoke of his plans to run for office again, to reshape Colombia from within. To others, he said nothing at all. Silence was one of his sharpest tools. Yet even in moments of apparent peace, the machinery of his empire never stopped. The Medellín cartel was not a company. It was a living organism, vast and precise. Factories hid beneath farms, and runways lay carved into jungles invisible from the sky. At its peak, the cartel supplied nearly all the cocaine entering the United States. The numbers were beyond comprehension. billions of dollars flowing through hidden accounts, warehouses stacked with cash, entire towns feeding on his wealth. He once burned a mountain of money to keep his daughter warm on a cold night. The gesture, both tender and absurd, captured the contradiction that defined him. To the poor of Medellin, Escobar was a savior. He built homes, schools, and soccer fields in neighborhoods long forgotten by the government. His projects gave shelter to thousands, and his name was spoken with reverence. Mothers blessed him, children sang his praises, and graffiti painted him as a modern Robin Hood. He walked among them with humility, shaking hands, offering envelopes of cash, promising change. For a moment, he was not the king of cocaine. He was the voice of the voiceless. But behind the generosity lay another face, the one few dared to meet. Escobar ruled through fear as much as affection. His reach extended into government offices, courtrooms, police departments, and newspapers. Bribes were offered like choices: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Those who accepted his silver lived comfortably. Those who refused were buried in silence. Judges fell, politicians vanished, and even the most powerful men learnt to lower their eyes in his presence. The empire thrived not because of chaos, but because of obedience. In the highlands, where fog rolled over the roads like slow smoke, convoys moved through the night. Each one carried a small piece of the empire: money, messages, shipments. Everything flowed like a system of rivers feeding into a single ocean. Escobar watched it all from his estate, calm and calculating. He did not need to shout or threaten. His power was understood. To his associates, he was a mystery, part father, part executioner. They loved him, feared him, and followed him as if bound by gravity itself. At home, he was a different man. His wife, Tata, described him as gentle, attentive, even shy. He adored his children, guarding them as fiercely as he guarded his empire. In the quiet of Hacienda Naples, he played with them by the pool, teaching them to swim, laughing softly as the afternoon light scattered across the water. For a few hours each day, he allowed himself to believe that he was simply a father, a husband, a man who had earned the life he built. But night always brought reminders: the phone calls, the reports, the faint echo of his own reputation chasing him through every shadow. Colombia itself was beginning to shift under the weight of his creation. The economy pulsed with illegal money. Entire regions relied on his patronage. The government, caught between dependence and outrage, could no longer pretend not to see. The Americans were watching too, tracing every flight, every rumor. Yet Escobar moved with the confidence of someone who believed fate had chosen his side. "They can chase me," he once said, "but I am already everywhere." The paradox of Pablo Escobar deepened with every passing year. He gave as easily as he destroyed, loved as fiercely as he punished. His smile could calm a crowd or seal a man's fate. To the world, he was a symbol of corruption. To many Colombians, a symbol of hope twisted by necessity. His empire was a reflection of the country itself, beautiful, brutal, and endlessly conflicted. By the mid-1980s, the Medellin cartel had become a shadow government. Even the state's most powerful institutions bent under its influence. Escobar's name commanded armies, his money silenced dissent, and his vision blurred the line between patriotism and tyranny. Yet, beneath the grandeur of his success, a quiet restlessness began to stir. For all his wealth, peace remained elusive. The walls of Hacienda, Naples, could not contain the unease growing within him. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Escobar stood on the balcony overlooking his estate. The air was still, heavy with the scent of rain. Below him, the animals roamed in lazy circles, their silhouettes blending into the gold of dusk. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke rise and vanish into the evening light. Around him stretched everything he had ever wanted: power, loyalty, family, empire. Yet, in his eyes, there was something hollow, something searching. He murmured softly, almost to himself, that he had everything a man could dream of. But dreams, he realized, had a way of turning against their dreamers. For all his might, for all his reach, one truth lingered like a shadow in the distance. Peace could not be bought, not even by the richest man in Colombia. The year was shifting like a storm turning in slow motion. In the valley of Medellín, the mornings came heavy with mist, and the sound of distant engines rolled through the hills like a memory of thunder. Pablo Escobar stood by the balcony of his home, the city sprawling beneath him, glowing faintly beneath a restless sky. Power, he had learned, could fill rooms by silence, even bend the law itself, but it could never buy belonging. Somewhere inside him, a different hunger had begun to grow, not for gold, but for grace. He had become the ghost everyone obeyed, yet he longed to be the man everyone admired. So he turned his eyes toward politics, that fragile theater where respect was minted and immortality was written in newspapers. Escobar began to imagine a new story for himself, not the smuggler, not the outlaw, but the savior of the poor, the man who rose from the streets to speak for them all. His empire already fed hundreds, built homes for the forgotten, and bought medicine for the sick. In his mind, this was the natural next step, to wear the mask of legitimacy, to turn fear into applause. The first rallies were small but electric. Crowds gathered in dusty fields, faces lit by conviction and curiosity. He arrived not in luxury cars, but surrounded by children, promising them schools, football fields, dignity. His words were soft, his smile disarming. To the poor, he was already a legend, the man who built where others destroyed, who gave where others took. They didn't see the empire beneath. They saw a man who remembered them, and for a brief moment he believed it too. But the old families of Colombia, the ones whose names were carved into marble and law, watched with unease. They had spent generations building walls around power, and now a man from the slums was climbing over them with ease. His money could buy votes, but not acceptance. In Congress halls, they whispered his name with disdain. Behind closed doors, they made plans to remind him that no amount of charity could erase the scent of his past. Still, Escobar persisted. He bought a seat in the Chamber of Representatives, his presence both shocking and magnetic. The corridors of Bogotá were filled with polished shoes and cautious smiles. He walked among them like a lion dressed as a diplomat, his voice measured, his gaze steady. Every step he took echoed against marble floors, a rhythm of defiance. The air around him seemed to tighten. People greeted him politely, but their eyes betrayed a quiet terror. They knew what lay beneath that calm exterior, the empire built in shadows, the reach of invisible hands. He tried to speak their language of progress, of reform, of national pride, but beneath the polished words lingered something raw and dangerous. He wanted recognition, not negotiation, respect, not tolerance. His speeches carried the warmth of conviction, yet his silence carried the weight of warning. Then came the photograph. One single frame, circulated like a whisper, turned into thunder. Escobar, smiling beside a known narco-trafficker. The image spread through Bogotá like wildfire, each copy a spark that ignited outrage, The political elite seized the moment with surgical precision. They denounced him publicly, stripped him of his standing, and reminded the country who he really was. For Escobar, the fall was not from grace, but from illusion. The parliament that once seemed like a staircase to heaven became a courtroom without walls. Behind his calm face, something began to shift, a slow, cold transformation. The humiliation was not just political, it was personal. He had offered himself to the system he once defied, and it had spat him out. He returned to Medellín quieter than before, his pride bleeding beneath the surface. The city welcomed him, as always, but he was no longer satisfied with applause. The rejection had burned something sacred inside him. The dream of legitimacy dissolved into smoke, leaving only the purity of power, the kind that didn't need permission. He began to see politics for what it was, a theater of fragile men pretending to rule. And he decided then that real rule would no longer require their stage. Rain fell hard that evening, smearing the city lights into streaks of gold and red. Escobar sat alone in his car, the windshield wipers whispering against the glass. He thought about the photograph, about the laughter echoing in Congress, about the promises he had made to himself. In the quiet hum of the engine, a new resolve began to take shape. If the state would not accept him, he would build his own. If power refused to embrace him, he would make it kneel. From that night on, his world began to darken, not with anger, but with clarity. The man who once wanted to be loved by his country now wanted to own it. He looked out over the rain-soaked city, where the poor still whispered his name with reverence, where the rich still feared to say it aloud, and he understood the cruel symmetry of it all. Every ballot denied to him could be replaced by a bullet. Every rejection was a seed for rebellion. Somewhere deep in his mind, he recalled an old saying. His mother used to tell him that pride was the devil's whisper in a man's ear. He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Pride, he thought, was all he had left. By dawn, the mist returned, rolling down the mountains like a curtain being drawn. Escobar's dream of politics had ended, but something else had begun, colder, quieter, far more enduring. It wasn't the pursuit of acceptance anymore. It was the pursuit of control. He stood by his balcony once more, the same view, the same city, yet everything felt altered. The applause had faded, the illusion dissolved. But in its place stood a truth he could finally embrace. He no longer needed the state. He was the state, at least in the shadows, where laws dissolved and loyalties were bought with fear and favor. And somewhere beyond the valley, as the sun broke through the clouds, the first tremors of a war began to stir, a war born not of politics, but of pride. The air in Medellín grew heavier with each passing week. It clung to the skin like dust that refused to wash away. In the mornings, the city woke to the echo of sirens, distant, mournful, unending. And at night, there was only the hum of helicopters circling the hills, their spotlights crawling over rooftops like restless ghosts searching for a name. They already knew. Pablo Escobar's empire had reached its height. Yet it was no longer a kingdom, it was a fever dream. The man who once commanded silence now lived inside it. His face, once smiling on posters of charity, now haunted the newspapers as a name whispered behind closed doors. The poor still called him Don Pablo, their saint of necessity. But to the state, he had become a storm without warning, a threat too vast to contain. It began quietly. A judge missing on his way home. A minister's car reduced to ash before sunrise. Bombs that didn't just destroy buildings, They shattered the illusion of safety. The streets of Bogota and Medellin trembled beneath invisible footsteps. No one knew where the next strike would come from, only that it would. And through it all, Escobar sat at the center, calm, methodical, certain. Yet inside that calm, something was breaking. He had built his world on control, on knowing who to trust, who to punish, who to pay. But now, even his most loyal men spoke with hesitation. Eyes darted, voices lowered. Each betrayal, each arrest, each explosion brought him closer to the edge of paranoia. At Hacienda Naples, the laughter that once filled the gardens had gone quiet. The zoo still stood, elephants grazing under grey skies, birds calling from cages, but it felt like an echo from another lifetime. Escobar walked the paths alone, his reflection in the lake rippling under the wind. The animals looked back at him as if sensing the weight of his solitude. Even in his paradise, he felt surrounded, not by enemies, but by ghosts. Every sound carried meaning now. A ringing telephone, a slammed door, the chirp of a radio in the distance. All could be warnings. His world had become a hall of mirrors, and in each reflection he saw a man slightly less human than before. He began sleeping in different rooms, moving before dawn, changing cars and faces. The power that once made him untouchable now made him a prisoner of his own legend. Outside, Colombia bled in silence. Bombings turned routine. The smell of smoke and dust became part of the air. Mothers learned to pray before each sunrise. Children memorized escape routes instead of songs. The country no longer counted days by dates, but by disasters. And somewhere deep in the mountains, the man responsible for it all stared at maps lit by candlelight tracing borders of a kingdom shrinking, faster than he could save it. Escobar told himself it was all for purpose, that the war he waged was a fight for respect, for survival, for justice against a system that had exiled him. But at night, when the noise faded and the walls seemed to breathe, that conviction thinned. He began talking to photographs, his mother's, his children's, seeking in their stillness a forgiveness he could not name. The power that once defined him now drained him. His hands trembled more often. His gaze grew distant. He ordered executions with the same voice he once used for blessings. There was no thrill in it anymore, no satisfaction, only the mechanical rhythm of a man trying to hold back an inevitable collapse. Each death felt less like victory and more like delay. He was no longer conquering. He was erasing. Those closest to him noticed the change. His laughter came less often, his temper shorter. Meals went untouched. He spoke in fragments about destiny, betrayal, fate. There were nights when he would stand by the window for hours, watching lightning flash across the hills, muttering names that no one recognized. The government called it the war against Nostra, but for Escobar, it was something deeper, a war within himself. He could not separate the man from the myth anymore. To survive, he had to become what they already believed he was. So he leaned into the legend, becoming the monster they needed to fear. In doing so, he lost the last trace of who he had been. There were whispers among his men that El Patrón was losing touch with reality, that the walls of his empire were closing in, but no one dared to speak it aloud. Fear had become the language of loyalty, and in that silence, Escobar's world grew smaller, darker, and quieter. The terror that once spread outward began folding inward. His enemies no longer needed to hunt him. His paranoia did the work for them. Every victory felt hollow, every escape temporary. He had built a kingdom of shadows, and now he was trapped within them. One evening, as rain fell against the windows of one of his safe houses, Escobar stood before a mirror. The glass was cracked, splintered across his reflection. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, almost gently, he whispered to himself, "Even kings of shadow cast none in the dark." The words hung in the air like smoke. In that moment, he seemed smaller, not the ruler of an empire, but a man alone with the consequences of his own creation. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, only silence answered back. Colombia would remember the explosions, the blood, the fear, but what it could never see was the quiet unraveling behind those walls. The sound of a man suffocating beneath his own legend. The tragedy wasn't in his fall, but in how long he kept standing after his soul had already fallen. And as the night deepened, with the rain whispering against the ground like a requiem, Escobar closed his eyes and finally understood the one truth that had followed him all along, that every empire, no matter how powerful, is built not on stone, but on silence. By the time Pablo Escobar surrendered, Colombia had grown tired of breathing in fear. The air itself seemed bruised, and even the rain fell heavier, as if the skies were weighed down by exhaustion. When the authorities announced that he would build his own prison, the world stood silent in disbelief. A man who had shaken nations would now confine himself, though only in name. They called it La Catedral, but it was less a prison than a monument to irony. Perched high above Medellín, it looked down upon the valley like a watchful god disguised as stone. From the outside, it resembled a monastery, tall walls, towers lost in mist, the cross of the chapel gleaming faintly through the fog. Inside, it was something stranger, half sanctuary, half illusion. Escobar had designed every corridor, every locked gate that only he could open. The guards were his men. The rules were his own. In the kitchen, cooks prepared his favorite meals. In the courtyard, friends gathered to share laughter that never quite sounded real. He had traded freedom for a stage where he remained the director, the warden, and the prisoner all at once. Days unfolded with an eerie calm. Mornings began with the distant sound of church bells drifting through the clouds. Sometimes he would stand by the window, watching Medellín Belot's streets shimmering in rain, its people living stories that no longer involved him. There was a peace in that distance, a fragile kind of control. Yet beneath it, something hollow stirred at night. Candlelight painted the walls with slow-moving shadows. He walked through corridors that smelled of damp stone and memory. Each step echoed like a thought, refusing to fade. His companions tried to keep the mood alive. Soccer matches on the courtyard field, bottles of rum passed around, music from an old radio humming against the night. But Escobar's laughter came softer now, trailing off before it reached his eyes. He often spoke of destiny, how he had built everything from nothing, how even the government had bent to his design. But those words sounded rehearsed, like lines he no longer believed. Power, once roaring in his veins, now felt like a faint pulse. He had built a fortress to escape the world, only to find that the walls trapped more than his body. They contained the noise, the chaos, the purpose that had once defined him. There were evenings when fog rolled, so thick across the hill that even the guards vanished from sight. On those nights, Escobar would sit alone in the chapel. The candles burned low, and the smell of melted wax filled the air. He would stare at the crucifix for hours, not in prayer, but in study, as if trying to decipher the meaning of surrender carved into wood. The silence of La Catedral was deceptive. It carried the weight of unspoken confessions. Outside its gates, the world moved on. Rivals emerged. Allies faltered. His empire, once infinite, began to crumble at the edges. News arrived in whispers, each one a reminder that the storm he had created continued without him. There were new names in the headlines, new faces in power, but none with the gravity he once commanded. The legend was beginning to fade, replaced by something smaller, a man hiding behind walls of his own making. Inside, time stretched like mist. Days became indistinguishable from nights. He kept schedules not for necessity, but to pretend that control still mattered. Visitors brought updates, money, contraband tokens of a world slipping beyond reach. Each gift felt like proof that he still existed out there somewhere, in the chaos beyond the gates. Yet each visit ended with the same look in their eyes, pity disguised as loyalty. Sometimes, when rain lashed against the windows, he imagined the valley below flooded and clean, the city reborn without memory of him. The thought frightened him more than death. Oblivion was the only punishment he feared. To be forgotten was to lose the only immortality power could promise. He wrote letters he never sent. He made lists of debts to repay, promises to keep, enemies to forgive. The act of writing steadied him. It gave shape to thoughts that otherwise dissolved into air. But by morning, he would burn them each page, curling into ash. Each intention consumed by the same fire that once drove him, La Catedral became a mirror. In its silence, Escobar saw the reflection of everything he had built and destroyed. The laughter of his children echoed faintly from old recordings. The scent of his mother's cooking visited him in dreams. The faces of the fallen friends, rivals, strangers appeared in the corners of his vision like unfinished memories. He was surrounded, not by enemies, but by the echoes of consequence. Months passed, and even the weather seemed to conspire in monotony. The same grey mornings, the same slow sunsets. The jungle beyond the walls thickened, alive and watching. The guards spoke of strange noises, at night footsteps where no one walked, voices carried on the wind. Escobar dismissed it, but he too began to feel eyes upon him. Not human eyes, but the gaze of the mountain itself, patient and ancient, waiting for him to understand that no fortress stands forever. He began losing track of time. Clocks stopped being measured in hours, and instead in thoughts how many times he walked the same hallway, how often he reread the same letters, how long a candle burned before it surrendered to the dark. Each repetition chipped away at the illusion of control. Power had always been an external thing, but isolation revealed its hollowness. A king without a kingdom, a ruler without an audience. Then came the whispers from beyond the walls. The government was changing its stance. The United States was pressing harder. The deal that had built the cathedral now trembled. Helicopters started to appear more frequently, their distant hum threading through the fog. With each passing day, the horizon seemed to move closer, as if the outside world were reclaiming him inch by inch. One evening, as the rain returned in slow, deliberate sheets, Escobar stood by the barred window of his chamber. The valley glimmered with scattered lights, blurred by mist. He listened to the wind, to the faint murmur of guards exchanging stories, to the far-off mechanical rhythm of blades cutting air. It was the sound of inevitability, the sound of something approaching that even he could not command. He turned away, extinguished the candle, and whispered to himself words no one else would hear. Perhaps it was prayer, perhaps resignation. The rain kept falling, steady and endless, as though cleansing the mountain of memory. And somewhere in that vast night, between thunder and silence, the echo of helicopters grew louder. The night Escobar vanished from La Catedral, the mountains of Medellín swallowed him whole. The mist was thicker than usual, rolling over the walls like smoke from an unseen fire. Somewhere beneath that shroud, a door opened, quiet, deliberate, inevitable. The guards who once obeyed him now hesitated, torn between fear and duty. They heard his footsteps fading into the fog, and though they knew they should raise the alarm, none of them moved. It was as if the mountain itself conspired to let him go. When morning came, the news spread like wildfire through Colombia. El Patrón had escaped his own prison. What followed was not celebration, but a cold tremor that passed through every home, every government office, every street corner. The illusion was broken. The deal that had once promised peace had turned to smoke. Now, the most hunted man in the world was free again, and freedom had never felt so fragile. Escobar moved like a shadow through the countryside, traveling under false names, carried by loyalty that was starting to rot at the edges. Safe houses that once welcomed him with open arms now closed their doors in silence. His empire, stretched thin by greed and fear, began to fold in on itself. Men who had once kissed his ring now whispered his name only in regret. The world beyond La Catedral had changed. The old codes no longer held. The US agents circling overhead, the search block hunting every whisper. The rival cartels scenting blood in the air, all moved with precision and purpose. Power had shifted, and for the first time, Pablo Escobar felt what it was like to be surrounded. He moved through jungles that seemed to breathe against his neck. In the dark, he could hear the insects humming, the river whispering his story back to him in fragments. Every sound felt amplified, a twig snapping, a dog barking in the distance, a radio crackling from a patrol half a mile away. He had lived his life in noise, the roar of engines, the chatter of weapons, the applause of fear. Now the silence was worse. Silence made room for thought. Each night, rain fell without mercy. It soaked through the tin roofs of his hideouts, pooled under his boots, seeped into his bones. Sometimes he would sit by a small, flickering bulb, studying maps that no longer mattered. The lines of supply, the routes of escape, all obsolete. The men he trusted were ghosts. The money he buried might as well have been ashes. Still, he traced the maps with his finger, as if the act alone could rewrite the story. His family was already gone, scattered in exile under false names, protected yet distant. Letters reached him through hidden channels, written in trembling hands. His wife begged him to surrender, to save what little was left. His mother prayed for him from a house that felt emptier each day. But Escobar was not a man who knew how to yield. To surrender was to erase himself from the myth, to accept that the empire he had built from nothing had turned on him. So he kept moving, town to town, shadow to shadow, always a step ahead, yet never far enough. In some villages, they still whispered of his generosity, the patron who once gave food to the poor. In others, they cursed his name, seeing only the ruin he had left behind. The truth lived somewhere between the two, a man trapped inside the legend he had created at times. The chase felt endless. Police convoys slicing through the rain, helicopters hovering above treetops, radios murmuring coordinates in code. Each operation brought them closer, yet Escobar always seemed to vanish at the final moment, slipping through alleys or disappearing into forests that knew him by heart. but even the jungle tires of hiding a man forever. Morning comes gently to Medellín. The first light slides across the wet rooftops, glinting off puddles left by a night of quiet rain. The hills breathe mist again, as they always have, soft silver clouds rolling down into the city streets. Buses hum awake, children run to school, vendors sweep water from the sidewalks. Life, as it always does, continues. But beneath the hum of the living, there is an echo. It drifts through narrow alleys, over crumbling walls, through the broken windows of old estates, now reclaimed by ivy. A whisper, faint but persistent. The ghost of a man who once ruled this valley like a storm. Pablo Escobar is long gone. His house has been leveled, his fortune scattered, his enemies either buried or forgiven by time. Yet in the silence between, the city's noises, his name lingers, not shouted, not celebrated, but breathed, almost unconsciously. El Patrón, for those who remember, his presence was never simple. To some, he was the devil who wrapped the city in fear. To others, the man who built schools, houses, and football fields when the government would not. Duality runs through every memory of him, saint and sinner, giver and taker, protector and destroyer. In a small neighborhood once watched by his men, a mother hangs laundry in the sun. She remembers the years when curfews ruled the streets, when gunfire echoed through the night like fireworks without celebration. Her son, born after the war. For the soul of Medellín asks her about Escobar sometimes. She answers softly, "He was a man who gave, and a man who took away." Down the hill, the air smells of damp soil and exhaust. The market buzzes again. Vendors trade stories, the way they trade, fruit ripe, bruised, passed from hand to hand. "He helped my uncle," one says. "He killed my brother," another replies. The conversation fades, unfinished, like most stories about him. In the museum that stands where his mansion once rose, glass cases hold the remains of a life lived too loudly. A phone, a pistol, a family photo framed in gold. Tourists walk quietly through the rooms, their reflections sliding across the polished floors. They take pictures, whisper facts, and leave. But the walls seem to absorb something deeper. The air inside still feels heavy, as if history itself has not exhaled. Outside, in the streets, the city has changed. The skyline stretches higher. Cafes bloom where fear once lived. Young people talk of art, technology, and escape. They wear headphones, scroll screens, live lives that have nothing to do with the empire of dust that came before them. Yet sometimes, when thunder rolls across the valley, even they pause. The rain carries an old rhythm, one that once meant sirens, or morning, or both. The older generation watches the new one with quiet awe. They survived something the world still struggles to understand. They know that Escobar's story was never just about cocaine or crime. It was about the hunger for power, for belonging, for immortality. A hunger that can live in anyone, given the right mixture of poverty and pride in the heart of Medellín. There is a mural, bright, defiant, impossible to ignore. It shows Escobar's face dissolving into smoke, half angel, half ash. Below it, someone has written, "We remember, but we do not repeat." The message is both prayer and warning, because even now, decades later, the world remains fascinated by him, by what he represented, by how far one man's will could reach. His legend has outgrown his crimes, transformed by time into something mythic, almost cinematic. But behind every legend lies the cost, the silence of those who did not survive the making of it at night. When the city cools, when the rain returns, and the lights flicker like distant memories, the ghost of Medellin stirs again. It is not Escobar himself, not his spirit, not his face, but the shape of what he left behind, the power of a story that refuses to die. You can hear it in the way the old men speak in bars, lowering their voices when his name comes up. You can see it in the way guides pause before saying too much during their tours. It is not fear anymore. It is reverence mixed with fatigue, the strange respect one gives to a storm long past, still remembering how it once broke the sky. Every empire leaves a residue. For Rome, it was ruins. For Escobar, it was myth. His empire was built not on stone or sand, but on memory, fragile yet enduring. The memory of a man who wanted everything, and for a moment held it. History does not forgive, but it forgets unevenly. In Medellin, forgetting is a form of healing. The city no longer hides from its past. It lives alongside it. The hills where soldiers once hunted men now bloom with music and laughter. The sound of gunfire has been replaced by the sound of children, playing their shouts echoing where his mansions once cast shadows. Still, when rain begins to fall, as it always does here, it brings a strange quiet. Raindrops slide down cracked statues, wash the dust from memorial plaques, and gather in the corners of empty lots where his bodyguards once stood. The city listens, if only for a moment, to the voice of water-cleansing memory. There are stories told in whispers now, about the man who dreamed too big, who tried to buy time, who mistook fear for loyalty. Each retelling changes him a little, shaping him into whatever lesson the teller needs. Some call him a warning, others a mirror. All agree on one thing: Medellin will never truly be free of his reflection, and maybe that is not a curse, but a truth that no place ever escapes the ghosts it creates. They remain, softened by rain and distance, watching quietly as the living move on. The night grows deeper, the city lights shimmer beneath the fog, and somewhere, faintly, a radio hums, static, familiar, eternal. A song from another time, a fragment of the man who once believed he could outlive fate. The rain falls harder, now steady and patient, tracing its own history across the streets, washing away the years, the rumors, the grief, washing but never erasing. In Medellin, life continues, layered over its memories, haunted yet alive. The ghost does not ask to be seen. It only asks to be remembered. And in the end, perhaps, that is what remains of every empire, every myth, every man who tried to rewrite the rules of power. Not the wealth, not the terror, not even the body, only the story, because stories do not die. They wait, they whisper. They return when the rain begins again, and in the city he once ruled, the rain still falls, washing away but never forgetting.